Welcome to When Giants Were Giants, a deep dive into the 1986 Super Bowl champion New York Football Giants. As always, Leonard Marshall, two-time Super Bowl champion, is with me, Elliott, our producer, Dylan Burns, and we are joined today by our special guest, an old friend, Gary Myers. Gary, welcome.
How you guys doing? Thanks a lot, Elliott. Hi, Leonard.
How you doing, Gary?
Gary has been covering the NFL since 1978. The Cowboys beat writer for most of the 1980s for the Dallas Morning News, longtime New York Daily News columnist, great author of football books, has a lot of experience with that 86 New York Giants team, and we'll talk about that. But I want to start with, Gary, you're the author of a New York Times best-selling book, Brady versus Manning. You just finished a whole season-long podcast on Tom Brady. Nobody knows Tom Brady better. Let me start with this question for both of you. How would Tom Brady, in his prime, fare against the 1986 New York Giants?
Leonard, why don't you brag about that 86 Giants team first?
Well, I can tell you this, Gary. I mean, and you know how this 86 football team was built. This team was built on defense, and it had a lot of pride. And the ringleader of that defense was Bill Parcells. From the time I arrived at the Giants in '83, Gary, he imposed his will upon myself. He imposed his will upon Carl Banks, Gary Reasons, Pepper Johnson, Mark Collins, Eric Howard, and a whole host of characters that we drafted from 1983 to 1986 to come in and become part of that 86 championship football team. I can honestly say that the impact that Bill Parcells had on that group of kids was outstanding and tremendous. Because keep in mind, in 1983, he almost lost his job as a head football coach in New York Giants. And he totally flipped that thing around in 1984 when we won our first playoff game. And I don't know how many years that the Giants hadn't been in the playoffs by beating the Rams on the road and now being a team that, okay, maybe these guys can play a little bit of football. Maybe Parcells can coach a little bit of football, alongside Bill Belichick and a whole host of other characters that he had. So in looking back in retrospect, the three greatest quarterbacks during my era that I played against were John Elway, Joe Montana, and Dan Marino, and not in any typical order. The only other quarterback that I felt that didn't get his just due during that time, and because we didn't see a lot of him, was Jim Kelly. How does Tom Brady rank up with those guys? I would say the only two guys I think that gave him a run for his money, or that would give him a run for his money, if he played in my era or at the heyday of my era, Montana for sure, but probably Dan Marino. What's your thought, Gary?
Well, Leonard, I think that Tom Brady and Joe Montana are basically the same player. Lightly regarded coming out of college. Neither one of them had an arm like John Elway. Joe was definitely more nimble. There's no question about that. Sprinting out a little bit and throwing on the run, that's not Brady's game. Both of them outstanding, stepping up in the pocket to avoid the pass rush. I think where you guys would have given Brady trouble, and what gives most quarterbacks trouble, to be honest with you, is pressure, especially pressure up the middle. And you know that Parcells and Belichick would have been aware of that. I thought that the Giant team of '07 exposed that in the Super Bowl with moving Tuck inside in that NASCAR package and getting to Brady up the middle. And that's what's always made him so uncomfortable. You guys,
Yes.
between you and LT and Carl and the rest of that crew, George Martin in '86, was so good at getting to the quarterback and making them, get off the platform back there and improvise that you would have given Brady problems. That '86 Giants team, especially defensively, was so good, and so many players that would have had to be accounted for by the offensive line and tight ends staying into block. That I think you guys would have got after Brady pretty good.
I mean, the pass rush between Lawrence and I was predicated on, collapsing the left side of your offensive line and then everybody else up the gut, that we could get to join along and contribute. We did that quite often, and we did it very well. Thank you.
The thing that I think about when I think about that 86 Giants defense, guys, is not so much how great you were against the enemy quarterbacks, and you were, but I've it was a heyday of great running backs just in the NFC in 86. Tony Dorsett and Herschel Walker in their prime. Gary will speak to them in a bit from covering Dallas. George Rogers, Eric Dickerson, Walter Payton, Gerald Riggs from Atlanta. People don't remember how great he was. I view this as one of the great run-stopping teams of all time in an era when running was so important. I know that Belichick defensively always likes to take the main strength away. I guess against Tom Brady, you would have to put the pressure on and maybe leave the running back a little more room than normal. But would you agree with the assessment that it was basically a great run stopping team, Gary?
Well, yeah. Like you said, Elliott, the game was much different back then because defensive backs are actually allowed to cover receivers, and now if you breathe on them outside of the 5-yard zone, there you automatically see a flag. So I think you were able to trust your cornerbacks a little bit more because they were able to be more physical than they can today. Now I really think stopping the run is secondary in every defensive coordinator's game plan because it's such a passing league. And but Leonard, when you said before about collapsing the left side of the offensive line, can you imagine? There is not a combination in the NFL today where you had Leonard Marshall with Lawrence Taylor behind him. Who do you block? You'd have to leave in a tight end on every play.
That's what's unbelievable. The only other combination I can recall of that was anywhere near similar was what Buffalo had with Bruce Smith and Darryl Talley. That was the only other combination I thought.
And maybe like Chicago, Richard Dent, and
yes,
they had Wilbur Marshall behind him for a while, and
yes.
Otis Wilson, and that Chicago defensive 85 was pretty spectacular also.
Oh, it was unbelievable. That scheme, nobody had saw it, Gary. It was so unique, and it had a whole host of characters on it, which was really cool about it. That's a guy.
We're getting into this a little bit, but Gary, you a few years ago for the 30th anniversary of this 86 Giants did a whole, was it a series for the New York Daily News where you went back and talked?
It was the longest newspaper story I ever wrote. And I remember interviewing Leonard for that piece. And Leonard, remember when we met at the Giants office to take some pictures that day?
Sure.
Yeah, I did it as one story, and it was the 30th anniversary. And instead of it being a "Where are they now" piece, because players' health, retired players' health, was and still is such a huge topic. Instead of being a "Where are they now," it was a piece about how are they now. And so I interviewed at least 20 players from that team, and the stories about the impact that football had on their lives, both mentally and physically, were just eye-opening to me. And talking to players like Maurice Carthon, and who had a stroke not long before I spoke to him that time, and some other players that had some real physical problems, either related or not related to football, but just how they were getting along, 30 years after, winning the ultimate prize in football. It was really, I had such a good time reconnecting with some of those players, but then again, some of the stories were so sad that guys that they were obviously not in the prime of their football lives anymore, but in the prime of their regular lives, were having so many problems.
I read that series recently. I read that article, and my big takeaway is how much of Harry Carson was the glue to that team, the bond, the story you told about Jeff Rutledge with Harry. If you can talk a little bit about that, and Len, talk about Harry being such a glue guy, such a big factor in the team.
Yeah, Harry Carson and I talk at least once, twice, if not three times a month. And he still lives in New Jersey. His son, Donald, is a doctor for the LSU Tigers, and I see his son when I go home to watch the Tigers play Alabama almost every time I go home, and I make sure that I seek out his son to let him know that I'm in contact with his dad, and his dad sends his love, and even though they do talk, it's important enough to me to do that. But Harry's a phenomenal guy. Always be my captain. He'll always be the captain of the '86 Giants football team in our defense, and a guy that we hold in a very high esteem, very high esteem.
I think Harry still takes that role, very seriously. And the thing that's so impressive about Harry as a person, and I've known him, since 1978, um, is as years have gone on, it's not only former Giant players that he reaches out to if they need help, but it's players who played in his era, with you, Leonard, who played for other teams. Look upon Harry as a captain, and younger players that might be having issues, current players, they still look up to to Harry. Um, he's just got that personality, and that he's such a caring person that he really embraces that role. And I think that that's such a big part of his life. Like Leonard said, captain for life. I mean, he does feel that way. And Elliot, when you mentioned before about Jeff Rutledge, and Leonard, I don't know if you remember this, when Jeff was in a bad car accident years ago. I don't recall exactly how long ago, but Harry, I believe, was in South Carolina at the time, and Jeff was. I can't remember if Jeff was in Alabama or Georgia or someplace down south. Harry just got in his car and drove there unannounced to visit Jeff. It was a very long ride. He got there, he stayed for like an hour, made sure Jeff was okay, and got back in his car and drove back to South Carolina. I mean, they're just there aren't a lot of guys who that far removed from being teammates with somebody would still feel not only the responsibility or an obligation, certainly wasn't obligated to do that, but just in his heart, he felt it was necessary to do that just because as the he still thought he was the captain of that team. And one of his guys needed him, even if he didn't reach out to say, Harry, I need you by my side. Harry took it upon himself to do that. And I mean, he really, in that kind of a role, he is really one of a kind.
And he taught me how to do that. He taught me to do that. I just helped a teammate. I won't mention name, but I just helped a teammate get through a very trying time. That was a family he had a family related issue that his mother was going to lose her home, and I just helped this guy get through a situation that was near and dear to his heart. He was struggling to try to figure out how to do it. Um, I helped him save his mother's house. I helped him save a relationship with his family. He's no longer a player. He hasn't been a player for over 30 years, and you know, I take pride in being able to help someone that's in dire need, or help someone as a teammate. That's it. It's important enough for me to extend my hand out because I would expect one of them to do that for me. So, but
Len, can you tell the story about helping the former teammate get his Super Bowl ring back?
yeah, speaking of stories, I'm in the Bahamas. Um, you know, gambling at the Atlantis Casino and Resort, Gary, and I'm on the crab table, and there's a guy shooting crabs three stalls away from me, and I eyeball out of my right eye, and I see the guy had on a Super Bowl ring, and I said, "Damn, that looks like our ring." And I look again, and sure enough, it was our ring. And I asked the guy about it, and he told me. He said, "I acquired a ring from Bobby Johnson." And I asked him how he got it, and he said, I paid for it. And he said to me that he'd be willing. I said, would you be willing to return the ring to the Giants? Maybe the Giants could buy the ring back from you, or I'll buy the ring back from you and make sure it goes to the rightful owner. I said, I don't know how you end up getting the ring, but whatever. I mean, what's it going to cost to get it back? He said, well, we could work something out. And so, long story short, the Giants stepped in. Bill Parcells bought the ring back. They got the ring back to the player, and the rest of it is history. The ring belonged to Bobby Johnson. I don't know how this gentleman ended up getting the ring, but kudos to Bill Parcells and the Giant organization for stepping up the plate to make sure that one, Bobby was made whole, and two, that the gentleman that acquired the ring was made whole. But it's just unfortunate that things happen, like you said, Gary. Some players are going through some things that people will never know about, and I guess the fortunate thing is that guys step up to the plate for other guys, and that's what was unique about the '86 Giants, is that group of guys. And even though you hear Bill Parcells talk about it quite often, that is the tightest group of players he's ever coached as a head football coach. It is sincere when he says that, because that's the way I think most of the guys see each other.
Well, that begs another question then, because I know it's a family atmosphere. I know it's a wonderful camaraderie led at the top by Bill Parcells, who I know very well and everything. How did this family handle it when Lawrence Taylor was going off the deep end? I mean, in 1985, he's playing most of the year on crack. He's having problems. He's rehabbing with golf. I want to hear how the teammates responded to, tried to help Lawrence. Talk a little bit about that. And then, Gary, what was it like covering Lawrence Taylor? Still, to this day, there has never been a greater defensive player in the history of the league, probably.
I don't know if Gary remembers this or not, but when you walked in the Giants locker room, it was Harry Carson's locker, Lawrence Taylor's locker, and then my locker. And Parcells put me next to those two guys, as he would say, to keep an eye on my tail. Okay? I ended up keeping an eye on them two because I wanted to find out exactly what the hell they were doing to be so successful in the Giant organization. And if I could mimic everything they were doing, I might be all right in the eyesight of Gary Myers and the other guys that cover the team. Because the guys that cover the team, Gary will tell you at the time, there was a revolt in our locker room at one time when the players didn't play well in the early '80s. That players kind of saw the media as communists, and Parcells would talk that kind of stuff in our locker room. Gary knows what I'm talking about, and Bill Varigan and Hank Gola and all those guys. I remember Hank Gola and Jim Burke getting into it in the locker room and all that kind of crap, and just a mess. I dressed next to Lawrence for 10 seasons as a Giant, and I can honestly tell you, I never knew Lawrence Taylor was using drugs. That's the God's honest truth. That's the God's honest truth. And that was 1985.
Before I moved to Dallas late in the '81 season, I'd covered Lawrence up until that point. So from the time that the Giants drafted him and then, through part of the '81 season. And I just knew him as a fun-loving guy. There was I can't remember the bar that wasn't far from Giant Stadium. Was it like the front row or?
The front row and the bench.
The bench, right.
Bench.
So after the Saturday night preseason games, when we'd all get done writing, we would go to the front row. Elliott was like literally not even an eighth of a mile outside the parking lot.
And Doug Van Horn owned it.
Right, that's right. And so we would see Lawrence in there just having a good time. There were a bunch of players that would be in there. And, he'd come over and talk to us and we'd joke around with him. And then I was gone by the end of the '81 season when I moved to Dallas. And then I moved back in May of 1989. So all the stuff that had happened with Lawrence at that point was while I was in Dallas. So I wasn't there to see if there was any changes that were coming about, or how the players were reacting to him. But I will tell you this, that I can't remember what year it was that Lawrence was up for the Hall of Fame. Probably was like 1999, something like that. And I went to his house, and like the big issue then, and I wasn't on the Hall of Fame committee then, but I am now. But the big issue then was, should Lawrence's off the field transgressions be counted against him when it came time to vote? And I knew that there was a mandate to the Hall of Fame voters that it was only what you did on the field that gets considered, not anything that happened off the field. But then it's a private ballot, and there was nothing you can do if somebody said, I'm not putting LT on there. He was suspended for drug use, or whatever, or he hurt his team that way. So I just wanted to do a story on Lawrence about what his thoughts were prior to the vote, and I spent a lot of time with him, more than I ever had in one period before. And listen, Leonard, you know better than anybody. When Lawrence wants to be, he can be completely disarming and charming and the greatest guy in the world. And that's what I saw that day at his house, which doesn't mean that his troubles were over, because I believe that he had some other issues even after getting into the Hall of Fame. But there's never a guy that I ever really rooted for harder than Lawrence to get their life straightened out. I mean, most of the guys that, I got to know, were pretty together guys, right? But Lawrence was the guy that you knew had some issues that I was really hoping that one day, what's the expression, when the light bulb goes on or something like that he would just get it and realize, there's so many great things that he can accomplish in his post-football life that if he can just get it together, those things would be open to him. But boy, as a player, he was unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Leonard, I'm going to push you one more time with this. So there'd be days when he would show up, and there'd be the film showing to put in the game plan, and he'd be sleeping in the back of the room, and you had no idea. He would get up, be quizzed. He could handle the defense, but you had no idea.
No idea. I'm telling you, it'd be like we had a grandpa chair in the room. The grandpa chair in the room belonged to Harry Carson. Okay, and he was the grandfather of our group. So the grandpa chair belonged to Harry. Sometime he and Lawrence would play games and switch. And next thing you know, Lawrence would have the hood over his head. And Belichick would call him and wake him up. And he'd go, oh, yeah. Can you come up here and show what you do in this situation if the Cowboys are in this formation? And, oh, sure, of course I will. And he'd get up there with the marker, and I don't know, half the time he did it, but he actually knew where to go. And he'd start drawing, and then guys would start, egging him on and giving him hints as to what to do and how to do it. So the deal was Belichick went along with it as long as he played along with it to not cause chaos in the room. But, we knew what was going on. We knew that, it was a system that was flawed and that, there were Taylor rules and everybody else.
Tell me about the Pace University in the preseason and the two-a-days and the amount of contact you had and practicing, Leonard, against that offensive line, Brad Benson, Billy Ard, Bart Oates, Carl Nelson, Chris Godfrey at the right tackle. Tell me about those practices.
Well, I can honestly say this, that, it was some of the most physical football that I'd ever become acquainted with. I mean, back then, from 1983 to about 1985, practicing at Pace was probably the most treacherous thing I'd ever been through. And I guess it was because, and Gary would know a lot about this, that Parcells was cut from the cloth of Ray Perkins. And Ray Perkins could give a damn about another player. Am I right, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, those practices were brutal.
Even for that time, right?
Yeah, I mean, a ton of hitting, right, Leonard? I mean, always in pads.
A ton of contact. what I heard Ray Perkins one summer, and Gary can attest to this more than I can because he was there in '81. I heard in '81 that Ray Perkins he brought 91 guys to training camp. More than half of his roster was on injured reserve going into the fourth preseason game. That's what I heard.
Those numbers would, so you're saying 45 players went injury reserve? There'd be nobody left to make the team.
That's what George Martin told me. George Martin said he had guys on crutches. There were guys with casts on. He said you wouldn't have believed these. And I said to him, as tough of a guy as Lamar Leishman was, he must have been really crazy back then because he had Gary Jeter, he had the Tabor brothers, he had John Mendenhall, he had a whole host of characters.
Oh, I remember all those guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it must have been crazy, right? He said Gary Jeter was the biggest prick in Lamar's side that you could think of. Lamar Leishman rode him, and Parcells rode Jeter so hard that it was just a mess. He said every day there was something going on. And I said to him, oh, it couldn't have been worse than he did me in 1983, because in '83, I almost went to blows with Lamar several times at camp.
I mean, I know that Parcells really believed in contact and practices. And Leonard, can you imagine Parcells coaching today?
Oh, no.
With the way the rules are? It would just be impossible. I mean, there's hardly any practice with pads. There's no hitting. There's no two-a-days.
Defense is optional.
Oh, defense is optional. That's right.
Tell me, Gary, you saw Parcells, and you look at that coaching tree that spawned from him, and you look at Belichick and Romeo Crennel and Sean Payton and Mo Carthon and all these players. It's a very impressive, one of the most impressive coaching trees. Parcells, were there players that you covered that you knew would be future coaches? How would you know who would be a good coach?
Wow.
That's a hard question, right, Gary?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I knew LT would not be a good coach.
I knew he wouldn't be a great broadcaster, and he showed that on TNT for a
while. Like Phil would have been a great coach, right, Leonard?
Yes, Phil would be a good coach.
Phil has, with his son Matt, is running. He's got this whole business going now, working with high school and college quarterbacks, where he's training them. I thought Phil would have been a great coach, not just a quarterback coach or an offensive coordinator. I thought he would have been, a great head coach. Harry, if he wanted to, Carl Banks for sure, right? Carl was always, I thought, one of the more, intelligent players. But Leonard, the reason I don't think any of those guys ever went into coaching, and maybe you can even say the same for yourself, I don't think the great players make great coaches, because standards are so high and their frustration level is so high when a guy can't do it. Like if Leonard's trying to teach a guy a pass rush technique and he doesn't get it, I would just think it'd be really frustrating. Right? When do you ever see like the great quarterbacks become coaches? How many? I mean,
it's hard to do. It's hard to do.
I mean, Sean Payton was a quarterback at Eastern Illinois. He was a replacement quarterback in '87 during the strike. Jason Garrett was a backup quarterback his whole career. Frank Reich was pretty much a backup quarterback his entire career. I'm trying to think who else. Mike Shanahan was also a college player at Eastern Illinois. Meanwhile, Eastern Illinois had Shanahan, Sean Payton, and Tony Romo. That's pretty good.
Right. That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
So, when I was in Dallas, I thought a guy like Doug Cosby, and Leonard, went against him, sure. And he went to college coaching. He was a tight end there. And he actually worked on Bill Walsh's staff at Stanford for a while. And I thought Doug had the ability to be a head coach. I didn't necessarily think Diassi, who you got to know with the Giants, was going to be a head coach. I think it takes a real dedication for these guys to, first of all, make the money that they make. And even though it wasn't as great in your day as it is today, Leonard, I can't even imagine what you'd be making today. Um, but, for them to work for less money and put in longer hours, um, that's a tough transition to make unless you just love the game so much and want to be around it. Um, Most of the big name guys, make an attempt to get into broadcasting rather than coaching.
Gary, one or two more things, and we'll let you go. We've taken enough of your time, but I know you're a big Mets fan, and to me, the 1986 Mets and the 1986 Giants have a lot in common. The personalities, the wild personalities that have endured for decades, but also the fact that it didn't go well the next year. It did. They never. The Giants won in 1990, but if the year or two after, why didn't I know that it was the player strike and all but assuming there was no player strike in '87, do you think the Giants could have had a little mini dynasty going?
I remember that the Giants lost their first two games before the strike, if I remember correctly. And then George Young didn't want to insult this team that was coming off a Super Bowl by going out and aggressively recruiting a replacement team. So the Giants replacement team, even though I think LT played in the last game against Buffalo, the replacement team went 0-3. So then the regular team comes back at 0-5 in a shorter season. I think it was a 15-game season. They cut out one game. But Leonard, you know this better than me. That the threat of the strike and the threat of the owners to have a replacement team, although you played two games prior to the strike, I always felt that kind of hung over your team, and you wouldn't have gone 0-2 if it was just a regular season. That I just thought that a lot of the players thought the season was going to be over after two games, that the strike was going to wipe it out because everybody knew the strike was coming after the second game, that we didn't really get a fair indication, certainly not with them coming back at 0-5 trying to make the playoffs. But I don't think we got a really good indication of what that 87 team could have been like coming off a championship because the strike was hanging over everybody's head until it actually happened after the second game.
I 100% agree with you, and I'll tell you why I say that. That season was probably the toughest season for our team to come back from after winning the Super Bowl, because we had a cast of characters that had now seen the evidence of the work that we put in after we got our asses kicked by the Chicago Bears and embarrassed at Soldier Field, to come back and rebound, to play as well as we did in '86 and be successful. We wanted to prove to the world that it wasn't a fluke, that we were that team. It wasn't a fluke. We were worthy of being 17-2 in '86, and we'll show you just how good we are if we had a chance to come back and do it again. Unfortunately, we had the strike to deal with. Unfortunately, we had to deal with uh, going to practice in Washington Township in Joe Morris and Harry's backyard at a high school instead of being able to go practice at Giant Stadium and have those coaches and have their support and the weight room and everything else that we had with gaining momentum in '86. So I always tell Elliott that the '86 Giants, I thought, could have won 4 Super Bowls because that's when teams really stuck together, Gary, pre-strike. So in '87 we could have had a shot, no strike. '88, no interruption, we probably could have been okay. '89 we should have been able to continue. That's the game where we lose to the Rams and the Flipper Anderson catch. '90 we win it, and then '91 if Parcells had come back, there's no telling what kind of team would have hit the field. So I say, and Sims and I have this conversation all the time, that maybe that '86 team could have been a 4-time Super Bowl champion instead of a 2-time Super Bowl champion.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because, from a distance you can say, okay, '87 season, was an aberration. We shouldn't count that. It's an asterisk because of the strike. So why couldn't they just pick up where they left off in 1988. Go from 86 to 88 and make believe 87 didn't happen. Well, it doesn't work that way. All the players are 2 years older. A lot of the players aren't around anymore. Now it's even more true now with the roster turnover from one year to the next because of free agency. But even in those days, there was a lot of roster turnover. So the '88 team wasn't the '86 team, and there was a year in between. So it's a shame that that team never had an opportunity at what I would even call full strength, meaning just a normal season to show what it can do. One thing I wanted to mention about Parcells, and he tells me this all the time, and I still talk to Bill, multiple times a year. And Leonard, obviously, you remember in the locker room when he's giving that speech, and he goes, "You know what, guys? Nobody can ever say you didn't do it because you did it." And he always tells me championship bond players for life. And I don't think, and I've been around a lot of teams now over the 40 some odd years I've covered this league. I don't think there's a team that I've ever been around that's more true of than the '86 Giants. And I really got a feel for that, guys, when I did that story a few years ago. And like I said, I talked to more than 20 players and how they still stayed in touch and they cared for each other. And, stories like Leonard told before about helping a teammate's mother keep her house, and Harry going down to see Jeff Rutledge, and Harry convincing players to go to the doctor who were afraid of going for checkups because 20 years after playing they were nervous about what doctors could find, and it was almost like, I'm better off not knowing. And Harry said, "No, you're not. You got to go to the doctor. If it means I take you to the doctor, I'll take you." How players still call Parcells on his birthday. I just think that all the great things that you can say about football, and believe me, there's a lot of bad things. I mean, the physical toll it takes on players is unbelievable. But I think the greatest thing you can say about football, more than any other sport, and the '86 Giants more than any other team, is that these group of guys still care about each other. And now, 35 years later, they're still in touch with each other. And whenever they have a reunion, it's like they went from the last team meeting of 1986 to today with nothing in between. It was like they were together yesterday. And Leonard, obviously, you know this a million times better than I do, but I really think what I'm saying is true, and you've lived it, so you've experienced it.
Oh, Gary, I'll give you a classic example. I got a call from Harry about the Ring of Honor. We've had this conversation, you and I. Harry said to me, "Leonard, it's a farce. It's a farce. You're one of the greatest. The right side of our defense is one of the greatest trios in the history of pro football in any organization. You got three guys that were perennial all pros playing next to each other. We played next to each other for more than 6 years as New York Giants, and you're not in the Ring of Honor. You're the only defensive player with the credentials that deserves to be in the Ring of Honor that's not in the Ring of Honor."
Absolutely.
So he said to me, "This is uncalled for." He goes, "And I'm going to do something about it." Now, this is my teammate talking to me. I didn't call him and tell him about it. I don't say anything about it. I mean, you and I might have spoken about it. Elliott and I might have spoken about it once or twice, but it just goes to show you the love, the camaraderie, the professionalism, the integrity amongst this group of men from the '86 Giants that leaves me sometimes baffled, because it's the closest knit group that I've ever played football with in my life.
Guys, that's powerful stuff. When Giants were Giants. Gary Myers, thank you very much for joining us. Leonard, just tremendous. It's like a class reunion, and you guys have more respect and admiration for each other now than you guys did when you were kids playing with each other, it seems like.
Absolutely.
We'll be back next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you.